Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop of Radio Rothbard, and I want to let you guys know about two great events we have coming up soon. The first is on April 22nd in Birmingham, Alabama, and the focus is The Great Reset. We've got a great lineup including Michael Rechtenwald, Alan Mendenhall, Jonathan Newman, and a reporter from 1819 News, Amy Beth Shaver. They're going to be talking about the plans of the Davos elite and what Alabama is doing to fight back against it. It's going to be a great event. Then on May 20th, in Reno, Nevada, we have an event dedicated to property, civilization, culture, featuring some Mises Institute heavyweights. The lineup includes Tom DeLorenzo, David Gordon, and Bill Anderson. We always love seeing our audience at these events. It's a great time to network, talk with like-minded people. You won't want to miss these. Find more at Mises.org/events and check out our full schedule of events coming up.
This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here are your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome back to another episode of the Human Action Podcast, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Bob Murphy. How you doing today, Bob?
I'm doing all right, Jeff. How are you?
Well, as I'm sure some of our viewers and listeners have heard, I am actually departing the Mises Institute for a new job. This may, in fact, be my last Human Action Podcast. Not sure if I will appear as a guest in the future, but nonetheless, it's in good hands. Dr. Murphy is going to continue the show, find lots of great guests whom you should suggest to him, and also potentially another co-host down the road. But Bob, I just was thinking last night about this final show for me anyway. I was looking back over the previous Human Action Podcast. It actually started about 8 years ago, back in 2015. Clay, our producer, and I started what was then called the Mises Weekends podcast.
This is Mises Weekends with your host, Jeff Deist.
Podcasting was a very different animal back then, and we had lots of different guests, lots of noteworthy guests on a lot of, I would say, socio-political, Austrian, libertarian type topics. And then as we evolved into the Human Action Podcast, it sort of came to me that first there were too many podcasts, certainly too many political and commentary podcasts, and that we needed to do something that was really purely Austrian, because there are some econ podcasts, but there aren't really any hardcore, pure Austrian econ podcasts, at least not shows of any discernible size. So that was when we changed the name from Mises Weekends to the Human Action Podcast. And Clay will certainly remember this. There was a period where I said, hey, look, why don't we do books? Why don't we tackle the biggest, baddest books in the Austrian canon? Because that way we will distinguish ourselves from any other podcast just by the sheer substance of the show itself, as opposed to just sort of opining or talking. And second of all, it'll be like a Cliff's Notes for the various books. You know, we'll read them. Some of them were so big that we had to do multi-stage delivery. We had to have multiple shows for particular books like Human Action, Man, Economy, and State. And we said, well, we'll walk through these books, and one of two things will happen. Either people won't read the book, but they'll know the basics from having listened to the podcast as sort of a cheat sheet, or number two, the podcast will actually encourage them to go out and get the book and read it. So I hope we did a little bit of both. But Bob, I know you were a guest on some of those book review shows.
Yeah, and I do remember that I thought it was interesting that you were, taking that tack of tackling books, and that, yes, it's a very highbrow endeavor appealing to the certain demographic that really wants to learn something. So I did appreciate that.
Well, I don't know about highbrow, Bob, but we'll take it. But for example, Human Action, which I had read obviously prior, not always straight through. Sometimes you read different sections, but that was something like 6 or 8 shows, and we had different people on for the different sections. I mean, that's the kind of thing that is really pretty heavy lifting for a podcast type format. And I think a lot of people over the years appreciated that, and those podcasts are still there. They don't have a time element to them. You can go back and listen to them anytime. But eventually, after doing Human Action, Man, Economy, and State, working through a lot of other Mises' books, Socialism, Bureaucracy, Anti-Capitalist Mentality, we did some shows on praxeology, both on Mises and Hoppe. We did a lot of shows on Rothbard's canon. I mean, we went through the Great Depression. We went through For New Liberty, the Ethics of Liberty, obviously Man, Economy, and State. as I mentioned, at some point, you have an audience that's pretty narrow. People who are just interested in these particular books, and especially if you have a book that takes up multiple shows, you have to have a listener who's kind of already invested to stay with that. So that was a challenge. But really, ultimately, what brought that to an end was just after a few years, just having to read or reread those books week in and week out to prepare for the show. It just cut too much into my time and other duties. So eventually, we sort of loosened it up again and went back to the format where you started as co-host. So that's the Human Action Podcast as we think about it today. And I'm just trying to think who, for myself, were some of the most noteworthy guests over the years. There's been some great ones. Obviously, I think Jim Grant stands out just for his depth and breadth of knowledge. And now Jim Grant is actually highbrow. I think we can apply that moniker to him. But I hope people benefited from the show. I hope they got something out of it. And I think it fills a needed gap. There really is a huge amount of economic ignorance out there. And to the extent there are podcasts, in sort of the FinTwit, DeFi sphere, none of them are really Austrian that I can think of offhand.
Yeah, I think you're right. And again, I'm sure we're offending a bunch of people. And, we know, guys, that some of you have your sort of niche things. And I've been a guest on many of your shows. We understand but just talking like mainstream stuff that people at, CNBC or whatever might come across that, there aren't too many that are explicitly Austrian that I can think of. And you're right. Those book ones you did too, Jeff, I do think like there's going to be longevity there, right? So those are classics that people want. So yes, maybe if you didn't have the highest ratings the weekend after it came out, but still people will be going to those 20, 30 years down. Because I remember that was one of the things, the first time I went to the Mises Institute when I was in grad school, I had read Human Action cover to cover by that point, but just hearing other people who had read it and getting up and talking about it, that really helped it click. So I don't underestimate the importance of that for people who are working through these classic texts. To then hear, you had experts come on and talk about it, like that really does just help guide people and make sure, oh yeah, okay, so yeah, my take on that chapter was okay. Or, oh wow, geez, I didn't even get what Rothbard was saying there. Okay.
Well, I find Human Action a lot easier than Man, Economy, and State.
Really?
Maybe it's the writing style, maybe it's just more philosophical, more based in logic. Rothbard has a very different style, but those books were never easy for me to get through. I was introduced to Rothbard, fortunately, just by sheer happenstance in the 90s. So I became aware of him at that time, although I didn't really understand his importance as an economist. And then just a couple of years later, he passed away. But yeah, this is tough stuff to get through. But I feel like we covered a lot of other great books, too. Mm-hmm. We did a lot of one-off shows on books by Guido Holzman, for example. We did a great show on Rothbard's The Betrayal of the Right. We did that with Tom Woods, who had written a big introduction to that, and that was really my introduction to the old right and understanding the divisions between National Review and some of the other conservatives, and understanding, you can draw a thread, I think, from the old right to the Mises Institute today. I mean, through figures like Mencken and Albert J. Nock. That when Republicans were good. Right. So that I think was interesting. And I think that, everything is cyclical, but I think today, in part because of the legacy of all these great books, I think the Mises Institute stands as really the current incarnation, along with maybe Chronicles Magazine, of that old right tradition. Now, obviously, that's not the only thing the Mises Institute stands for, but to the extent it still has a home, mm-hmm. I think it is with us in Auburn. So that appeals to me a lot. But
well, can I just add on that? Because this is something, too, that maybe it's obvious to you because you knew about this, I think, probably earlier in your life than I did in mine. But yeah, me growing up and learning about free market economics through the channel of, American conservatives that, in terms of as opposed to those liberals like the people on NPR or whatever, using the terms in the 1980s sense of what those words meant at that time, like Rush Limbaugh, that's what I thought. Oh, he's a conservative. I like Rush. And then sure. I start reading Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and get it. So coming from that lens, yeah, I kind of just assumed right wingers who know how the free market works are also really strong on military defense. And, mm-hmm. Those pansy Democrats are the ones that are anti-war and whatever, and don't you know how and so when you realize like how naive, even as I'm just trying to tell you this now, it sounds so ridiculous to say, oh yeah, the Democrats are against war and the Republicans, if you're for free markets, you got to be for a big military maintained by the U.S. federal government. It sounds so ridiculous, but yet that's what you might think growing up like in the late 80s and getting politically aware. So yeah, so the fact that the Institute kept alive that tradition of, well, no, there was a time when actual conservatives thought the U.S. government should mind its own business and not go across oceans to go bomb people. That's sort of, odd to people to hear that kind of talk.
And let's not forget that the Mises Institute was very out front in opposing the Iraq War. And that was a real schism on the right. In other words, George W. Bush was president, Tom DeLay was Speaker of the House, Dick Cheney, John Ashcroft, John Woo. I mean, that was really a time where Red America showed its worst side. Mm-hmm. And during that period, Lew Rockwell wrote a book called Red State Fascism. And so the Mises Institute was steadfast. And that's before my time. I'm not taking any credit for that. Mm-hmm. But the Mises Institute lost some fans and undoubtedly some donors for opposing that war. But, there are some things I think worth burning political capital on just for the principle involved. And I would say the same thing about COVID restrictions and lockdowns, which a lot of people on the libertarian side really embarrassed themselves with, I think, over the past 3 years. So that's a feather in our cap, certainly. But I guess what strikes me going back through some of these books that we did, and I should mention we did a multi-episode series on Hoppe's Democracy, The God That Failed. Mm-hmm. And we had a lot of different participants in that. But so that was very popular, and that's still a popular book. But what struck me is that I think the discussions and the interest in anarcho-capitalism, I think those have sort of peaked and receded. I want to say that was really, somewhere in that 2008 to 2012, really the Ron Paul era, when the old Mises.org forums, nobody uses forums on websites anymore, but those forums were quite vociferous at the time. And that was a real debate, the idea of society completely without the state. You wrote, Bob, you've written on that with your Chaos Theory book and otherwise. I mean, you've done a lot of speeches and you've made the case for pure privatization of, the judicial function in society, the police function, and the national defense function, or defense, whatever you want to call it. So that used to interest and animate me quite a bit, I think personally, but I think that's fallen away. I think you can sort of feel that in the air, that people have considered that, and some people accept it, some people reject it as crazy or foolhardy, of course. But it's not really the debate in front of us anymore. I guess none of us really expected the degree to which, maybe starting around 2015-ish with Brexit and Trump, how quickly things would deteriorate in the United States in terms of discourse, in terms of political comity, in terms of the red and blue state divide, just in terms of the very nasty politicization of everything. And I think the Mises Institute has had to shift a bit and adapt to that new reality. And so I was certainly one of those ANCAPs who even maybe 10 to 15 years ago would have said, some traffic cop or some DMV clerk has more power over you than Google because they can pull you over, or, whereas Google, your relationship with Google is voluntary. Okay. Fast forward to today, though, when we've seen what Michael Rectenwald calls governmentalities, we've seen this nexus of corporate and state power. So I'm not sure, and I hope the show, the Human Action Podcast, reflects this, but I'm not sure that libertarians were prepared for the degree, the rapidity with which the United States and the West would embrace fascism.
Yeah, I agree with everything. You had a lot packed in there. Just to respond to some of those comments. You're right. So as you say, I was very much involved in those debates over minarchism versus anarcho-capitalism proper, and that I don't get all worked up about that stuff anymore. And I think there's at least two things going on. So one is, back then, you were real radical and bold, and people are like, what are you, out of your mind? And now the things people are arguing about now are so much crazier than back then. Like now you say, hey, I think the government should privatize, who owns nuclear weapons. that's nothing, for people to say, no, I think, a guy should be able to say, I'm a woman and go in the girls' locker room in high schools. And that's what we're, which is in a sense way more shocking to me than to just say, should the military be privatized? And also because of, like you said, that I think your allusion to Brexit and whatnot, like, as you know, Jeff, I'm big on saying that I think Texas should be its own country. And because that to me is a much more practical thing that we can talk about, as opposed to, hey, what if, there was a worldwide Rothbardian regime or so, like that's just not going to happen anytime soon. And so, yeah, it's kind of nice to talk about, but it's like, would the Enterprise beat the Millennium Falcon in a fight or something? You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I'll have a debate there, but it's not really relevant to the real world right now. So, there is all that as well, I think. And you're right. I just like you, I also would have been one saying, let's say at least 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, that Google has no real power. Everything, it's a big corporation, it's voluntary, blah blah blah. Or if it's not, the problem is the state, and just limit the state power, and then the private corporations can't do anything to you. And now that does seem a bit just kind of obtuse, especially if it's the people who own the big corporations, especially like banks and whatnot, that are funding the political campaigns and deciding who are the people that are in office and staffing those positions 5 years from now. So it seems kind of silly to just point the finger at the people that in many cases were handpicked by the private special interests that were saying, no, it's not them. Don't look at them. That's free market, baby. So.
Well, and we should forget that we should not forget that things have evolved. I mean, when I was being introduced to libertarian ideas in the late 80s and early 90s, my older brother was getting Reason magazine. And at the time, edgy stuff was like the mayor of Baltimore, Kurt Schmoke, says, let's legalize marijuana. I mean, that was edgy, cutting edge stuff. Or when people said we shouldn't have taxpayer funded stadiums, that was sort of the level of libertarian analysis at the time. I mean, obviously Rothbard was already Rothbard by then, but in, as I came to think of it, and when you fast forward to today and just the political landscape, Daniel McCarthy, I know, at ISI has made this criticism that sometimes libertarianism seems ill-equipped to answer some of the big questions of the day. For example, the real question of the 20th century was very broadly, in the West anyway, socialism versus capitalism, right? That was the question. And so most people on the left would say, well, capitalism won. And a lot of people on the right, or people like me would say, well, I'm not so sure. I mean, we basically social democracy, which is a halfway measure towards full socialism, won. So that, obviously that depends on your perspective, but that doesn't feel like the 21st century question anymore. Socialism versus capitalism. It seems like people are dug in to their particular viewpoint on that. And the 21st century question is more who decides. In other words, at what level and at what degree of centralization or decentralization are we going to have to accept, as opposed to persuading left progressives who are arguing about trans bathrooms to accept Rothbard.
Yeah, and maybe the way I would put it is, like, I think if the libertarian people, including me from, the year 2000, could have glimpsed and seen, been transported quickly to the year 2050, and we're walking around, and what you would see is, there'd be a lot of, some of the technology would amaze us, obviously. We'd be, oh, wow, this is great. But on the other hand, there would be things that I think I would look at with horror, and it would kind of be like, oh, but that's a private company's policies that are doing that. And yeah, if you go up high enough in the chain, there's some government, some state somewhere, like the Chinese, whatever, Eurasian polity or something, People's Party of that group, that are technically leaning on a few of the people to make that the company's private policy decision. But strictly speaking, most of what I would see that would horrify me would probably be nominally a private sector outcome. And so that wouldn't mean it was right. I think it would just show that the framework that I was using in the year 2000 to analyze the world was not really, didn't fit very well by the year 2050.
Well, given that, what do you think ought to be the focus of the Mises Institute and also tangentially this podcast going forward? In other words, given the scarcity of time and resources and money and manpower, what should the Mises Institute's role be going forward?
Well, I'll say for the podcast, right? Because it's I'm doing subsidiarity, right? Even here, that I think that the podcast, like right now, especially because the banking sector is so relevant to to regular people's lives right now, and I think that's the avenue through which a lot of this stuff is going to transform very quickly. I'm not saying it should just be this, but I think a big component, certainly what I want to do in terms of, my position as an Austrian economist that some people in the public listen to, and is to, take the Misesian insights of money and banking and sort of bring them into, the digital age and communicate that stuff to the public so they understand, some basic like inflation, but the merits of 100% reserve banking, or what causes the business cycle and the dangers now, I would say, of a central bank digital currency, and the importance of sound money, things like that. That's so a lot of bread and butter, old school Austrian stuff. Mises in 1912. A lot of those themes, I think, are actually. It's a cliche to say it's more important now than ever, but it actually is, or at least than it has been in 30 years ago, I would say.
Well, I think there's a couple ways that the Mises Institute and this podcast in particular could distinguish itself from other shows, for example. And first is to talk about the cultural consequences of fiat money and, the ramifications through society, which are often hard to trace or draw directly. But that's the goal or the role of economists, is to show us the unseen, right? I mean, that's very difficult, but nonetheless, that's what we want from social scientists, to help us understand the trade-offs involved. And I know people like, Holzman and Seyfried Namus are really good at talking about how, we get fiat medicine, fiat science, fiat education, fiat culture, even fiat social mores. So I think that's a very important point, because the Mises Institute doesn't shy away from issues of culture or family or religion, or the more civilizational type questions. We don't have to be narrow in our approach. But the other thing is that I think only the Mises Institute really, at least as an organization, really stands for the idea that it's not just central banking as practice. It's just that central banking per se is impossible, that it is inherently political or becomes political, and that the idea that we can have, in effect, sort of a Politburo making decisions about money supply or interest rates or swaps or whatever it might be, asset purchases, that there's just no good way to run this. And so even a lot of our people on the libertarian side of things have been wrong about, their reform ideas for central banking. And I think increasingly free bankers, at least of a variety, are feeling defensive in the wake of the Silicon Valley Bank fallout and some of the other fallouts. And I think it's, Joe Salerno says in an article that I can recall vaguely that, free banking's fine but if what you mean by that is a currency school free banker. I think that's what Salerno termed himself. And that's when free banking is truly disciplined by the marketplace and is not basically leveraging off a fiat system. So I think that's an important distinction. And I think the idea of not only sound money, which is very, very important, not just economically, but culturally, as I mentioned, but sound banking, sound money storage. That sounds awfully old-fashioned, both of those things. That sounds like the 1800s, but they might become very important in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I have to just amplify something that associated scholar of the Mises Institute, Peter St. Onge, said. I had a conversation with him. I don't know that it came up, Jeff, because I had him as a guest when maybe it was even like literally the last episode or two when you couldn't be with us. I don't know that it came up there, but then I was talking to him separately, and he brought it up. Could we talk about 100% reserve banking, and and it sounds like this big thing, and you have to lobby. And he just made the simple observation that, well, no, it would just take a simple rule change or even just a tweak of how it's enforced. That, like, what if a customer went to a commercial bank and wanted to open up a checking account that was going to be fractional reserve, that they just had to kind of fill out a thing, just a suitability requirement, just to make sure, just like if you want to open up an account and trade put options or something, they kind of make you do something just to kind of show what kind of the basic what you're doing, just as a check. And that, so because his point was that, yeah, if you ask people, do you think the bank takes your checking account deposits and puts them in the vault with your name on it? Most people probably say, no, they don't do that. But then if you ask them, more sophisticated, like, do you think the bank has your money if you need it or something? Or, would you be upset if they did? I think if you ask just a few more questions, it's pretty clear that the public's notions about what actually is going on is not quite right. And so, it was just a simple point like that to say that there's real world applications, and this isn't merely just us doing science fiction and describing, some Martian colony where the banks are 100% reserve. Like, this stuff is real, especially now with easy, technology improvements. It's more practical to try to do some of this stuff and implement it, at least just to have an option. That's the thing. It's not that we have to reform the entire system, but just to make it as a viable option. Because, you and I have talked about this, Jeff. The sort of free banker response of, well, nothing's stopping you right now. No, actually, there are things stopping it right now. Like, there are institutional barriers, decisions that the Fed has made, like not giving access to certain applicants to their network and such, that makes it impractical for a viable 100% reserve bank to emerge right now, in the current environment. And so things like that, yeah, I think it is becoming more relevant. Stuff that was just more of an academic debate within the Austrian school 10 years ago is now a lot more relevant for real people. Like, there's, people in congressional testimony asking bureaucrats, like, is fractional reserve banking sound or something? That's, anyway.
Well, I think if you follow Per Byland on Twitter, he's very adept at making the point that there's this kind of nonsensical idea that theory and application are wholly separate and can never be reconciled. He's excellent at making the point that theory is how we know everything. I mean, theory is how we approach the world and deal with the data that's out there. So I think that's important. I think we're going to find that Austrian principles are proven correct in the coming decade. I think we're going to have a rough time for our economy, for banks, et cetera. So, Bob, before we wrap up, do you have any thoughts about future guests or anything else you'd like to discuss?
Well, I do certainly want to discuss your book, so that maybe we'll have guests on to talk about your book. But you got this new book, A Strange Liberty, that has recently dropped, and do you maybe want to just tell the listeners a bit about its origins?
It's an anthology. I think Clay can show the graphic while we speak here. It's available at Mises.org if you go to the bookstore. It's also, I believe, just in softcover. It's also available on Amazon. I think there are some hardcovers left there. They cost a little bit more. So essentially, I've been working on a theme for a long time, which is that it's too late for politics in the United States and in the West, that we're beyond being able to vote our way out of this. And I think that reflects itself in our political landscape. So that's the title, both of an essay and also the book, Politics Drops Its Pretenses, which what I mean by that is that it wasn't that long ago, certainly within the memory of people alive today, that, politicians were hated. And I don't want to say that there was some golden time where politics was more above board or less seedy or less corrupt or anything like that, because that's simply not true. But at least for average Americans and their relationship with the political world and with the media, things were very different in our grandparents' or our parents' time. I remember my dad telling me, people would have a picture of JFK in their home, like above their fireplace. If you walk into somebody's house today and they have a picture of Joe Biden above their fireplace, I think you better get them the help that they need, let's just say. So things have gotten very, very spooky in the sense that politicians no longer pretend that they want to represent the entire electorate or the entire population. Now they're quite open about wanting to vanquish their political opponents. And now
Right.
that's different. That's changed. That's changed just in my lifetime. In other words, they've dropped this pretense that democracy, well, it creates a compromise down the middle. We have the far left and the far right, and none of those crazies on the outside get everything they want. But down the middle, we compromise. And we all get a little bit of what we want, and we're finding out that that's not true at all. So-called democracy, at least mass democracy, is practiced at the national level in a country the size of the U.S. It just produces this permanent bureaucratic class, this managerial state that's totally unelected, that's got union protection, that can't be bounced no matter who you vote in. And as we saw with Trump, I mean, it scarcely matters who you elect as president. So, politics is no longer pretending to be at all win-win, like as we conceive of the marketplace. It's just a pure zero-sum game with a lot of nastiness involved now. Like when Biden made that speech where he was behind that really red backdrop and it looked like something out of Nuremberg or whatever. I mean, that's basically saying, we intend to go a certain direction, and if you don't like it, too bad, because we're winning and there's more of us at the ballot box. That's not a healthy place for a society to be. And I think you and I, Bob, would agree that America's far too large. It needs to break up into some constituent parts. Progressives don't believe in that because they don't want to give away any turf if they think they're going to win the whole thing. But nonetheless, that's the theme of the book. It goes into the immigration and borders debate. I try to show both sides of that. It goes into a lot of what's happening at the Fed and with central bankers. In other words, these people are not the magicians or the alchemists we thought they were. It turns out that they're kind of groping around in the dark. And it goes a lot into the Trump phenomenon, the Brexit phenomenon, the idea of decentralization and secession as really the only nonviolent antidote to what we're facing now. And again, I would say that there are progressives on the left and the right who insist on a universal worldview, that there's one true faith, and that's got to apply everywhere in politics. And that's a form of religiosity, you might say. But nonetheless, it's an anti-political book, I hope. Mm-hmm. And I hope people get some enjoyment out of it and understand the perspective that whatever it is that gets us out of this, whether that's something more at the local level or the state level, or whether that's something that entrepreneurs create or that technology assists us with, it's going to come far from outside Washington, D.C. It's not going to come through politics and the U.S. federal government in terms of its dollar, its debts, and especially, this is the worst thing of all, it's its entitlement promises. The Washington, D.C. is too far gone. And our approach now has to be to turn our backs on it and start trying to create a new reality from the bottom up.
We just a real quick one response to what you said, and then more substantive reply is you mentioned Biden. When he was given that speech, what was that? Was that a State of the Union or an inaugural? Where there was the red backdrop? I forget what the occasion was.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't a State of the Union because that's held in the.
I didn't mean State of the Union. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in any event,
I don't recall either.
Yeah. In any event, it was. I remember like when those iconic images were flying around Twitter the day the day after it happened, and a lot of like libertarian types and right wingers were showing it and saying things like, some lighting tech is about to lose his job," and I was just astonished that you think they would put him out there with all that lighting and stuff, not on purpose. Like they didn't realize how that was coming off. That wasn't deliberate. Like, I mean, it's kind of so it was funny, and maybe a lot of them, they were just kidding and they knew it was deliberate and they were just trying to make a dumb joke. But still, like it really just showed the divide. Like even among people who, I believe in lower taxes and like there's, I don't know if you've seen it, Jeff, but there's now an argument because Dave Smith made a remark about how there's many ways in which we have less freedoms than his grandfather did or something. And of course, everyone's bringing up, so you don't want women to vote and have checking accounts and all that stuff. But beyond that, they were saying this is the freest time for Americans ever, and it just, so it is, and these are among people that, probably agree with us on a lot of stuff about, free trade's great and, inflation's bad. So it is interesting to see that divide. So as far as your book, can you just tell, because I think one of the phrases that you have popularized is post-persuasion America. So for people, one of your essays talks about that. So can you just explain, like, what do you mean by that?
Well, I believe the phrase was coined, maybe, or at least popularized by Steve Bannon,
Okay.
who was one of the architects of Trump's victory in 2016. I was watching him on a PBS documentary called America Divided, and they had people like Robert Reich and all these different things, but they had Steve Bannon, and he was talking about this idea that people are largely beyond persuasion, which seems funny because we have this little cell phone in our pockets that has basically the sum total of human history and knowledge a few clicks away. And so that, given the fact that access to information and various arguments, and for instance, Austrian economics, it's never been easier to go read Austrian economics for free online. So access to information has never been easier. So at least in theory, we should be more open-minded as a result, or more likely to change our minds as a result, because it's easy to get an opposing viewpoint, or it's easy to get facts which disabuse us of our own viewpoint. But Bannon says, no, it's going the opposite direction. People are digging in more than ever, simply because there's so much white noise coming at them. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase, and the idea that, when everything seems unstable and shifting underneath your feet, and where there's just so much media, 24-hour cable news and the political jargon, and of course all of social media, we know so much more about all the trouble around the world than our grandparents did, that we actually begin to sort of shut down our thinking and our open-mindedness to opposing arguments and dig in our heels. So I thought that was a pretty interesting thing. And I thought that he had summarized that correctly if we look at how politics is actually operating these days.
Well, I think another element of that, too, is that for people who really care about a certain topic, they can go now find like 50 PhDs who agree with them and go read all their stuff. And so it's not merely like, that's just my gut level thing. Like, they can sit there and have a 2-hour debate with somebody about it. Like, whether it's climate change or evolution, or, and I've looked at those more so the climate change, the evolution stuff. I was more of a dabbler, but the people who hold the unorthodox view and are dismissed as anti-science by the people who hold the orthodox view, it's, you can say they're wrong, of course, and that they disagree with the professional award-winning scientists in those fields, sure. But they're not saying, I don't trust science. What they're saying is, well, no, if you actually look, the evidence says blah, 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 and there's this thing, and that contradicts this hypothesis. So they're not making anti-scientific argument. They're actually saying that, no, the conventional wisdom is overlooking these things, and they have a whole wealth of statistics and whatnot that they try to marshal, coming from people who have PhDs in the relevant fields. So because it's so much easier to find those people now with the internet. And so it is an interesting element of all this. So can I ask you though, Jeff, so what does that kind of dovetail, like if it's post-persuasion America, is that why just more federalism or nullification or even outright secession perhaps of certain regions is really the only solution, because we're not going to just talk it out and come to a mutual consensus? Like, we just kind of have to separate, or at least
I think that's entirely true. And I think if you look at politics today, neither side, so to speak, is really trying to build consensus anymore. I mean, we know what the left thinks of abortion. The left knows what the right thinks of abortion. I mean,
right.
That's just an irreconcilable difference. And so it really becomes about force. Who is going to prevail? Who is going to control the apparatus of government and make the laws, and especially control the enforcement of those laws? The enforcement's far more important than the laws on the books. And, we see that all the time. That's anarcho-tyranny, the idea that some people have to follow the rules and some people don't, and that government itself can be anarchic. In other words, not follow its own rules while making us follow the rules to a T, giving us a ticket for jaywalking or whatever it might be. So I think that's absolutely true, that some kind of soft secession is already happening. It's inexorable. We saw what happened this week in Wisconsin and Chicago with elections. I think that's going to accelerate and intensify. And so that's fine with me. Let the 50 states be more of a laboratory of ideas as originally intended. And the extent to which we can stop the federalization of everything, I think, is important. I think we ought to fight for that. And I think libertarians ought to learn a lesson about this what I consider a grossly incorrect interpretation of the 14th Amendment, and that really no one's being served. Even our progressive friends are not being served by the current situation.
Can I ask you one more, Jeff? Here, I'm just looking at the outline or the table of contents, and piggybacking on what you just said is some of the other essays next to the Welcome to Post-Persuasion America are what should politically vanquished people do, and then the case for optimism. So can you just speak a little bit, maybe that as perhaps closing thoughts for the listeners on this?
Yes, well, because being politically vanquished is better than being literally vanquished, being put in a concentration camp or something like that. But historically, being politically vanquished is a road potentially to a worse fate. And Mises talked about this a lot. He really fretted about minority groups in countries because he saw the old patchwork of Europe in the 1800s, even when, as a young man, come together into these modern super states. What we think of today as Germany, for example, was a patchwork. And so he was a little uneasy about that. If you go read Nation, State, and Economy, and liberalism especially, his big concern was always political minorities. And oftentimes for him, that was linguistic. We don't think about that so much in America anymore because everybody speaks English. A lot of people speak Spanish, and that's fine. Everybody, it's pretty easy. We have the luxury of not having to think about language. But in Europe, in Mises's day, I mean, the number of languages were. And so if you were brought into a political arrangement by the redrawing of a border, let's say due to a war, or some imperial ambition, that really affected you because, not only linguistic minorities, but ethnic minorities, whatever it might be. And so Mises was forever saying, they really need to have their, for democracy to function properly, they really need to have the ability to break away and reorganize politically. So I think that's an valued or underappreciated aspect of Mises, that he really was pretty decentralist because, he uses some terms about universalism, which he actually opposed, but talks about being a citizen of the world and a cosmopolitan. And so I think some of that was misinterpreted to mean that he thought we just, would be better with one giant superstate. And I don't believe that's what he meant. You can argue or debate that. And so I think it's very important that politically vanquished people begin, I think, looking at what they might do. And so when I remember that talk very clearly. It was in Newport Beach, California around 2015 or thereabouts. The case for optimism was just that we know, and we've seen since then, this is accelerating, that the federal Leviathan can't do what it promises. And so Atlas is going to shrug. We can't even fix minor issues like the Jones Act, which everybody knows should be fixed, much less remake Afghanistan into a Jeffersonian democracy or whatever. So, Uncle Sam increasingly is not going to be able to do the things he even purports to be able to do, like control the money, pay entitlements, at least in a meaningful sense, win wars, whatever it might be. And so I think there's a huge case for optimism out there simply because people are organizing and understanding this. They're coalescing around this, and it's an uneasy time. It's painful to think that we've really been sold a bill of goods, especially in the late 20th century. But nonetheless, I think empowerment starts with honest reflection. And so people are getting together more at the local level. People are looking at their businesses. People are trying to armor up their financial lives, their family lives, or their home lives, and maybe get more engaged or active locally. So I think all that makes the case for long-term optimism, even if there's some short-term pain along the way.
So, folks, let me push Jeff's book because he's too modest to do it. So it's A Strange Liberty. The subtitle, Politics Drops Its Pretenses. He's got a foreword by Paul Gottfried and an introduction by Tom DiLorenzo. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of fascinating ideas in there. And it's, Jeff is his own guy, right? It's not just parroting the views of other people. It really is, like, he's got his own perspective and makes the case for it well. So I highly recommend the book.
Well, thanks so much, Bob. We, the show, will be back with another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Bob will move forward both solo and with some new guests, and I look forward to checking that out every week. So Bob, have a great weekend. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you soon.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.